All right, now we're on to the research design. To think it through, the first thing to remember is that the main difference between an experimental study and a non-experimental study is that non-experimental studies only measure variables. But it's pretty easy to remember that they manipulated posture, given the big graphic on page 634 in the article. So, an experiment it is. If I wanted to check myself, I could search the file for the word experiment. Then I noticed the third line of the abstract refers to this experiment. Of course, if I hadn't thought about the variables, I'd want to keep checking. As far as the summary, we want to keep going to the summary of the results. You might remember that I like to start by refreshing my memory about the focus. When there are hypotheses or questions, I usually paste them into the section where I make notes about the results, like I did here. Now, I'll look for the information about whether each hypothesis was supported, starting with looking at the discussion. Shazam! There may be some quirky things about how the authors describe this study, but they at least seem to make it easy to learn what they found. As soon as I started skimming the discussion, I realized the first paragraph seems to touch on all the hypotheses. This is on page 637 of the article, and it hides a little bit because the figures and tables for the results continue through the discussion section. Since the authors don't relate the information in that first paragraph to specific hypotheses, it was easier for me to copy and paste the whole paragraph below the hypotheses in my summary worksheet so I could see how they matched up. You might notice that the paragraph jumps around a little in terms of how it relates to the hypotheses. The first sentence relates to the first hypothesis. When I figured out the operational definitions, I realized that affective states were defined as emotions, and being enthusiastic was in a positive category. So the information about enthusiasm and excitement in the findings related to the affective states part of the hypothesis. At least they use the word fear in both places. The second sentence also uses self-esteem, making it pretty easy to connect to the first hypothesis. Then the paragraph of the discussion moves on to how many words they used in the speech. Okay, word count. They're on to the third hypothesis now. Sort of. The last part of that sentence talks about emotion words, so I think that's also the first hypothesis. The last sentence of the paragraph of the discussion is about pulse pressure response. Fortunately, I remember the authors referred to pulse as part of the measurement of cardiovascular response, so I can be pretty confident that goes with the second hypothesis. So when I got done thinking it through and formatting it to make it a little easier to understand later, my notes in the results section of the summary looks like this. I do have information about each hypothesis, but it seems a little too efficient to have all of the important information about the results in one paragraph, and skimming is pretty easy, so I looked at the rest of the section. The second paragraph was mainly talking about using the word count from the speech task to measure emotion. That paragraph pretty much says what I was thinking when I saw that operational definition, that it's a unique approach, and then it adds some information about why it appears to be a valid measure. They're alluding to concurrent validity when they mention how it aligns with reports of being less sleepy and sluggish. The third paragraph comes back to how the results relate to the hypothesis, though. As I was skimming, the phrase, which was contrary to the hypothesis, caught my attention. Sometimes when I'm skimming and something jumps out like that, it's like my brain hits the brakes so hard I can hear the screech of tires. So, the third paragraph on the hypothesis. After I read the first sentence, I realized the rest of the paragraph was using secondary sources to analyze that finding in the first sentence, which I knew because of the names of the year and the year in parentheses at the end of the sentence, also known as a citation. After I confirmed that the rest of the paragraph was expanding on the first sentence, I copied and pasted the first sentence into my summary to start thinking about what it added. Since it was talking about the pulse pressure, I knew it was related to the second hypothesis, so I put it there. When I read my other notes about this hypothesis and the first part of the sentence, I realized they pretty much said the same thing. So what did this part of the discussion add to what the authors had already said? I focused on the part of the sentence that was different from what I already had, the part about it being contrary to the hypothesis. I had to backtrack a bit. Having the hypothesis in this section of the summary helped make that a little easier, though. After the phrase contrary to the hypothesis nudged me to look a little closer, I realized that the hypothesis was that participants in the upright condition would have a reduced cardiovascular response, but they actually had a bigger response, so that hypothesis was not supported. I did two things in my summary to help me remember that. First, I made sure I had an obvious cue that the hypothesis wasn't supported. Then I also put the word bigger in bold to make it stand out. It works for me, but you might have another approach that you find more helpful. You might have already noticed that I also added the words supported for the first and third hypothesis. After I compared the information about the results with the hypotheses, they were consistent. In other words, the variables appeared to be related in the same way those hypotheses predicted. So in the language of research, we say those hypotheses were supported. If it's easier for you, you could also use true, false, or something like that in your summary. You might remember that I was only in the third paragraph of the discussion when I found the information about the second hypothesis not being supported. I did keep skimming the rest of the section and didn't find anything that added to what I already had. When you skim the discussion, you might notice a sentence in the fourth paragraph that includes slumped and upright posture can influence affective states, results after the postural intervention but before the stressor, and modulate affective responding, results from after the stressor. The information before and after the stressor threw me off a bit because the related hypothesis was about the stress response, which would be after the stressor. Then I remembered that they did have two measures of affect, the self-report and the word count, and that sentence seemed to be referring to the self-report. So because I was curious, I went back to look at the procedure to see when they administered the self-report measure. They actually had participants take it 3 times, once at the beginning of the study, probably pretty soon after they arrived, then again after the participant was slumped or in the upright posture, and a third time after the stress task. I went back to the results and skimmed the paragraph about the affect measure to see if they indicated that the self-report scores somehow indicated a lack of stress response, but nothing jumped out at me. Then I realized I'd taken a few more minutes than I intended and wasn't finding that added to my understanding of stress, so I decided it was time to be done. And it would have been okay to be done before I went down that path. So if you didn't even think about that phrase, it's definitely not a problem. I designed the summary worksheet to help you identify the important parts of the study without getting overwhelmed by other details and help you organize that information in a way that makes it easier to understand. We'll work more with the information in the next module. Right now, it might seem like it was just as easy to highlight the related parts of the article or use a different process. I definitely get that. After you go through the process a few times and work with the information in the next module, though, you'll find it does help you understand in a way that other processes don't. And that's not just my opinion. Students frequently share that this is a valuable part of what they learn in this class.